is a social psychology PhD candidate at Stony Brook University. She conducts research on the psychological processes that affect how people cope with racism and sexism. She has presented her research in various national conferences, and her dissertation work is focused on how marginalized individuals use collective action in response to discrimination. And Miriam is going to talk with us about implicit bias. Please welcome her.
Hi everyone, I'm going to be talking about implicit bias. So before we talk about implicit bias, I want to reiterate the negative consequences of structural racism. And when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about a structure or a societal system in which public policies and institutional practices reinforce each other to perpetuate the unequal treatment of specific racial groups. And as my colleagues have pointed out, structural racism is pretty pervasive and widely impacting. We see that structural racism disadvantages minority citizens in many contexts and in various situations. So in the context of education, for example, we see lower high school graduation rates being seen among minority communities. We see structural racism in the school-to-prison pipeline, which disproportionately funnels public school students of color into the juvenile prison system. We see that in Long Island in the 1950s, for example, the government subsidized homes in the suburbs with deeds forbidding resale to African Americans, promoting the maintained segregation of towns on Long Island. We see evidence of structural racism with disparities in access to healthy food and supermarkets in minority-dominated neighborhoods. We see it with environmental hazards being closely located to communities of color. And we see this with issues of socioeconomic mobility. Even on Long Island, we see that non-whites on the island are nearly 5 times as likely as white individuals to be arrested on charges, typically resulting from traffic stops. And even we see similar rates with looking at drug possession arrests, even though studies do show that white individuals and minorities use drugs at about the same rate. In Suffolk County, non-white individuals accounted for 25% of the population, but 53% of all felony arrests in the past decade. In Nassau County, we see that non-whites make up about 30% of the population, but 67% of all felony arrests. So before I talk about what contributes to the prevalence of these issues, I want to emphasize a few points. The existence of structural racism does not mean that everyone is explicitly racist or thinks negative thoughts about certain racial groups actively. But a lot of people and a lot of us hold some degree of race-based bias because of the system that perpetuates this. And that bias can manifest itself in systematic oppression of people of color and perpetuate structural racism even if everyone is well-intentioned. And the bias that I'm referring to is called implicit bias. So implicit bias refers to subtle and subconscious beliefs that affect our understanding of certain groups of people. So it affects how we act towards them. It affects the decisions that we make regarding these groups of people. So we have a bias when, rather than feeling neutral towards a group of people, we have a preference for or aversion to a person or a group of people. So for example, we can experience implicit bias by simply holding negative attitudes about a group of people or believing negative stereotypes about a group of people. An important thing to note is that this phenomenon has the power to influence policies and conditions in the real world. It negatively impacts the opportunity that specific groups of Americans have to be successful. For example, an elementary school teacher may say and explicitly believe that he or she has equal expectations for all of their students, while in fact actually might expect students of color, let's say, to perform worse in a classroom environment compared to white students. And this is just based on a stereotype that this person might hold. Research shows us that simply holding these expectations actually changes the way that teachers are likely to behave with students, in that they don't try as hard to help the students succeed and may act in ways to confirm the expectations that they have. Students are likely to be aware of these expectations and the difference in the behavior in the treatment that they're getting, and their academic performance is negatively affected. and this perpetuates the structural racism that already exists in our school system. Implicit bias also perpetuates inequalities existent in the criminal justice system. For example, it can negatively influence decisions even made by judges. Judges may perceive criminality to be associated with African Americans. Research on capital punishment shows us that killers of white victims are more likely to be sentenced to death than are killers of black victims, and that black defendants are more likely than white defendants to receive the death penalty. Other research shows us that defendants with more Afrocentric facial features are given longer sentences than defendants with fewer Afrocentric facial features. Research also shows us that these negative racial associations that we might hold lead people to see danger or a weapon in certain cases where none might exist. There's a concept called shooter bias, and this highlights how much people associate African Americans with violence and weapons. In these studies that are conducted looking at shooter bias, participants are asked to make really quick split-second decisions about whether they're going to discharge a weapon for self-protection. And we see this with both participants who are just the average person, average participant, or people who are in law enforcement roles. This research has established that many people automatically and stereotypically associate African Americans with violence and weapons, causing them in simulations to fire guns more often when presented with images of unarmed black people and less often when facing images of armed white people. In healthcare, we even see that studies show us that black patients are often prescribed less pain medication than white patients who present the same complaints and symptoms. And black patients with signs of heart problems get referrals for advanced cardiovascular procedures less often than white patients with the same symptoms. Black women are also 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes nationwide. And we see that also that African American infants were more than 9 times more likely than white babies to be given formula in the hospital. And in terms of formula, it's recommended that women breastfeed their infants, and African American women are not encouraged to do so. As a consequence, we see that infant mortality, even in minority-dominated neighborhoods, are higher than in white-dominated neighborhoods. Infant mortality rates in neighborhoods like Uniondale and Nassau County are 13 times higher than infant mortality rates in neighborhoods like East Meadow, which have a higher minority population. We also see evidence of implicit bias in the treatment of employed people of color and in hiring decisions, in renting out properties to people of color, in providing loans to people of color. So even while individuals may not express some sort of explicit bias or explicit racism, we see that implicit biases, explicit biases, and structural racism are often mutually reinforcing. While structural racism has created racialized barriers to opportunity, implicit biases reinforce these barriers and are a mechanism through which it continues to operate. So what is important to acknowledge about implicit biases is that because it is hard to detect and because it operates in subtle ways, implicit biases can be held and are held by anyone. It's important to know and continue to discuss how this discrimination operates so that we can actually be better equipped to combat it. Thank you.